Welcome to SLUMBERVERSE! Oh gee, another dimension of naps!
There was a night when the tide forgot to turn all the way back, leaving the waves to breathe gently against the stones, like the sea itself had fallen into peaceful sleep. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor with its patient rhythm, and Celeste, who had tended this light for 47 years, felt something quiet slip through the salt-thick air. She heard it first, a soft sound that wasn't quite crying, wasn't quite singing, but something that made her set down her polishing cloth and listen with the whole of her weathered heart. The sound seemed to drift from everywhere and nowhere, carried on the wind that perpetually embraced her lighthouse point. She descended the spiral stairs, her bare feet knowing each worn step by memory, following that gentle call that pulsed in rhythm with the waves below. At the base of her lighthouse, where seafoam gathered like lace, sat a basket woven from fresh seagrass and lined with what appeared to be old letters. The paper was soft with age, bearing the faded loops of careful handwriting, words blurred but stubborn against the salt. Inside lay a child, perhaps 6 months old, sleeping with the profound stillness that comes only to souls who have never known anything but safety. His tiny fist was curled around a single white feather, and when Celeste lifted him, he smelled faintly of forgotten perfume and distant thunder. His first breath in her arms was both new and strangely familiar, as if the air had been waiting to belong to him again. He didn't startle at her lantern's honey-colored light. Instead, he blinked at it, almost smiling, and when he finally cried a few minutes later, it sounded like wind chimes made of whispered secrets. Celeste wasn't surprised by any of it. She was the sort of person who believed that some souls arrive with their own instructions, written in languages older than words. She carried him up the lighthouse stairs, each step feeling like a promise, and laid him in a drawer lined with soft flannel, the same drawer where she kept winter scarves and letters nobody ever claimed from her collection of lost things. She named him Ezra, meaning helper, the word warm in her mouth like bread fresh from morning ovens. The lighthouse had always been filled with mason jars containing the ocean's offerings, single keys that fit nothing, feathers still spiked with salt, buttons of pearl and wood and bone, bottle caps with gentle dents, notes that began with dear and never found their endings. Ezra grew among these vessels of forgotten stories, learning to look without grabbing, to listen for the gentle sound an object makes when it remembers being needed. Even as a baby, he possessed a stillness that made visitors whisper, not because he seemed strange, but because he belonged to silence in such a friendly way. He would watch dust motes dancing in the lantern room light and reach his small hands up, not to clap or sweep them away, but to cradle them as if light itself might bruise. On fog-wrapped evenings when gulls were mere suggestions in the white air, bright flecks would drift down from the great lens and hover over his open palms. Celeste watched these moments with quiet wonder as the flecks would pause, hesitate, then settle like fireflies that had forgotten how to blink. The townspeople began bringing their lost things up the lighthouse stairs because Celeste had always made it safe to admit, "You'd misplaced something dear, Mrs. Chen." From the bakery brought a thimble that had belonged to her grandmother. Dr. Martinez carried up a fountain pen that had stopped writing mid-sentence 20 years ago. Father Miguel climbed the steps with a prayer book whose pages had gone mysteriously blank. Ezra would sit swinging his small legs while Celeste catalogued each offering, and sometimes, when a person reached for their pocket and found emptiness where a memory should live, a tiny shimmer would loosen from the air and drift toward the child. He didn't grab these glimmers of light. He simply made a quiet place for them to land, holding them not to keep, but to let them rest until their owner's face softened with remembrance. Then the light would return to wherever such things go, like a sigh finding its way back to a chest. It never felt like magic to Ezra. It felt as natural as sweeping a porch before morning visitors arrived. Celeste told him stories while the great light turned above them. She explained that the lighthouse was both large and small, both building and hand, that its beam was a kind of listening that could save you in storms. She told him about names, how some are chosen and others are grown into, and each time she repeated what Ezra meant, the words seemed to settle deeper into his small bones. On clear nights when stars were visible through the salt air, Luke the fisherman would sit with Ezra on the lighthouse steps, pointing out constellations. Ezra preferred the nameless clusters, the small scatterings that belonged to no story yet told. He would reach toward them with open palms, as if he could cushion their fall, though they hung steady and unconcerned in their ancient patterns. There were evenings when townspeople found themselves at the lighthouse without quite knowing why, drawn by something they couldn't name. They would lean against Celeste's warm stove, holding tin cups of coffee that tasted faintly of smoke and thyme, while Ezra watched from his perch on the bottom stair. He observed how sorrow changed the shape of mouths and how laughter mended them without announcing itself. Sometimes a person would say, "I could swear there was something I meant to tell you," and a faint spark would slip free, drifting toward Ezra like a stitch loosening from worn fabric. In the garden behind the lighthouse, where Celeste tended rosemary and lavender and climbing sweet peas, she taught him that some things are returned and others kept until they can walk again. The autumn light painted everything gold, and Ezra learned to find the edges of himself, not by drawing lines but by breathing slowly, understanding that if you listen long enough, the sea will teach you what to keep and what to let pass through. As winter settled over the coast like a familiar quilt, Ezra's hands knew the weight of small lights, the temperature of remembered names, the softness of long-ago afternoons. He wasn't asking for these gifts. He was simply making a promise that echoed in the steady turn of the lighthouse beam above. If something falls, I will be here. If something wanders, I will keep a place warm for its return. Spring arrived with the slow patience of someone who knows they're welcome. And Ezra, now walking steady on legs that had learned the lighthouse stairs by heart, began to discover that the world spoke in whispers only he could hear. The mason jars that lined Celeste's shelves had always been part of his landscape, familiar as the sound of waves against stone, but as his third birthday passed like a gentle sigh, he started to understand that each vessel held more than forgotten objects. They held the soft echoes of human hearts. It began with warmth. When his small fingers wrapped around a brass thimble that Mrs. Chen had brought from her grandmother's sewing box, heat bloomed in his palms like sunlight through glass. He closed his eyes and felt something that wasn't quite seeing, wasn't quite remembering, but was somehow both. There were hands, careful and quick, stitching white fabric, while humming a melody that tasted of wedding cake and nervous laughter. The thimble carried the ghost of countless careful stitches, each one sewn with the hope that love might be strong enough to last through whatever storms were coming. Celeste watched him with the quiet attention she gave to her garden, noting how he never grabbed or demanded, but simply made himself available to whatever wanted to be known. When he opened his eyes and said, "She made dresses for brides and her humming made them lucky," Celeste felt her breath catch not with surprise, but with recognition. The next morning, when they returned the thimble to Mrs. Chen, the older woman wept with the joy of suddenly remembering her grandmother's voice floating through their small apartment, threading hope through difficult years. This became their rhythm, as natural as the lighthouse beam's patient sweep across the harbor. People would climb the worn stairs carrying objects that had lost their stories, and Ezra would hold them until the memories stirred awake. He learned that a fountain pen could remember the weight of important words, that a wooden spoon carried the taste of soup that had fed 3 generations, that a small brass key unlocked not doors but the memory of a music box that had played the same waltz every night until its dancer's dress wore thin and its song grew quiet. Dr. Martinez brought his father's stethoscope, explaining through tired eyes that it had stopped working decades ago but felt too important to discard. When Ezra held the worn instrument, understanding bloomed in his chest like a flower opening to morning light. "It still works," he told the doctor in his clear, careful voice. "It's just listening to different hearts now. Hearts that stopped beating but left their rhythm in the metal." Dr. Martinez carried the stethoscope home that evening and discovered that if he held it very still, he could indeed hear something, not the lub-dub of circulation, but the steady pulse of love that connects generations across the endless expanse of time. Celeste began teaching him that objects fell into 3 gentle categories, like tides that knew their own purpose. Some things wanted to be found, leaning forward in their patient way, eager to return to the hands that had missed them. Others wanted to rest, curling into themselves like sleeping animals until they were strong enough to carry their stories again. And then there were those that wanted to travel, carrying lessons that would make sense only in a stranger's hands, like seeds blown on wind to take root in distant soil. Father Miguel's prayer book presented a different kind of mystery. Its pages had gone mysteriously blank, the words lifted by some combination of salt air and time. When Ezra held it, he felt not words but silence, a profound, purposeful emptiness that wasn't absence but presence of a different kind. "The words are still there," he told the priest. "They're just resting. Sometimes prayers need to be quiet so we can hear what comes after, amen." Father Miguel began using the blank book for meditation, discovering that empty pages invited him to listen more deeply than any written words ever had. As autumn painted the coastal hills in shades of amber and rust, Ezra's sensitivity deepened. He learned to distinguish between objects that carried sharp grief and those that held gentle sorrow, between memories that wanted to be shared and those that needed to remain private. A wedding ring brought by a recent widow carried such raw pain that Ezra gently suggested it might prefer to rest a while longer. But a child's broken toy soldier practically vibrated with eagerness to share stories of imaginary battles and heroic rescues, its chipped paint holding the echo of a boy's fierce imagination and whispered confidences. The townspeople began to understand that what happened in the lighthouse wasn't magic in the flashy sense, but something more precious, the chance to remember that nothing beloved is ever truly lost, only temporarily misplaced. Their visits became pilgrimages of gentle archaeology, excavating buried connections between past and present, between the people they had been and the people they were becoming. Celeste kept a journal of these encounters, documenting not Ezra's gifts, but the healing that rippled through their small community like stones dropped in still water. She wrote about Mrs. Patterson finally smiling after her mother's sewing kit remembered lullabies stitched into countless baby blankets. She recorded the day Tom the fisherman wept with relief when his father's compass recalled not just magnetic directions, but the wisdom it had absorbed during decades of patient navigation through storms both literal and metaphorical. On winter evenings when fog wrapped the lighthouse like a soft grey shawl, Ezra would sit with Celeste, sorting through the day's editions. He learned that some memories needed witnesses, while others needed solitude, that healing sometimes meant holding tight, and sometimes meant learning when to open your hands. The lighthouse itself seemed to pulse with accumulated stories, its steady beam not just guiding ships, but holding space for all the small, essential moments that make up a human life. As the longest night of winter settled over the coast, Ezra discovered something that would change everything. Hidden in a small wooden box someone had left without explanation was a collection of beach glass, smooth, translucent pieces worn soft by waves and years. But when he held them, he realized they weren't holding individual memories. They were holding the spaces between memories, the quiet moments when people paused to breathe, to notice light on water, to feel grateful without knowing exactly why. These pieces of crystallized contentment had witnessed thousands of small joys, and in holding them, Ezra understood that his gift wasn't just about returning lost memories to their owners. It was about helping people remember how to be present for the moments happening right now, before they had a chance to slip away and need finding again. The beach glass revelation settled into Celeste's understanding like seeds finding fertile ground, and by the time spring returned with its patient green fingers, she had begun what she called simply the planting, the discovery that some memories lived in the spaces between moments, in pauses, in breaths, in the quiet contentment of watching light on water, had shown her that her garden behind the lighthouse could become something more than a place where herbs grew. It could become a living repository for the gentle archaeology of human hearts. Behind the lighthouse, where salt wind had sculpted the earth into natural terraces and hollows, Celeste worked the soil with her weathered hands, while Ezra watched with the careful attention he brought to all mysteries. She explained as she worked that memories, like all living things, needed proper conditions to flourish. Some required the full warmth of frequent telling, while others preferred the dappled shade of occasional gentle remembrance. The most delicate memories needed protection from harsh weather, and the heaviest ones needed deep roots to anchor them safely in the earth. They began with the beach glass itself, pressing the smooth, translucent pieces into the soil, like planting tiny windows into other worlds. Celeste chose spots with intuitive care, a green shard near where she planned to sow sweet peas, a blue piece beside the future lavender bed, a clear fragment where rosemary would eventually spread its needle-sharp leaves. As they worked, Ezra felt the glass responding to the earth's embrace, each piece settling with the contentment of something that had finally found its purpose after years of tumbling in the waves. The first seeds went into ground that seemed to hum with anticipation. Sweet peas that Celeste had been saving for 7 years, their hard shells softened by time and patience, were planted with whispered stories of young love and shy promises made under summer stars. As Ezra helped cover them with earth, he felt the seeds listening, absorbing not just moisture and warmth, but the essence of the stories that would nourish their growth into something more than ordinary flowers. Weeks passed with the slow patience that gardens require, and as tender shoots pushed through the soil, something extraordinary began to reveal itself. The sweet peas that grew from soil enriched with memories of first love bloomed in shades of pink that shifted like sunset, their delicate tendrils reaching toward the lighthouse, as if drawn by the beacon's steady promise of guidance. When evening breezes moved through them, visitors swore they could hear the faintest echo of whispered endearments. Soft as silk against the ear, Ezra spent hours learning to walk among these planted memories, discovering that his gift was evolving from simply receiving the stories held in lost objects to understanding how memories could be tended and nurtured like living things. The lavender patch, fed with lullabies that had been hummed over countless cradles, grew dense and fragrant, its purple spikes releasing not just scent, but the essence of being small and safe and unconditionally loved. When he brushed his fingers against these plants, he could feel the gentle rocking motion of mother's arms, the soft weight of sleep settling over restless children. The rosemary, planted with stories of family recipes and kitchen wisdom passed down through generations, grew sturdy and aromatic, its needle-like leaves holding the memory of Sunday dinners and conversations that had shaped entire families. Ezra learned that when he touched these herbs, he could taste not just their sharp, piney flavor but the salt of tears shed over perfectly browned bread. The sweetness of reconciliation served alongside dessert, the warmth of belonging that came from sharing meals prepared with love. Celeste gave him a small leather journal, its pages soft with age, and taught him to map the garden, not with conventional symbols but with marks that captured feeling rather than location. A gentle wave beside the rosemary for names that wanted to return home. 3 soft dots near the lavender for lullabies waiting to be remembered. A delicate thread sketched beside the sweet peas for promises that could stand again, stronger, for having been tested by time. As summer deepened and the garden reached its full flowering, the townspeople began arriving, not with the urgency of seeking, but with the peaceful intention of tending. They came carrying not objects but themselves, drawn by something they couldn't quite name but recognized in their bones. Mrs. Chen brought her granddaughter to help weed around the patch where childhood games had taken root, hopscotch rhymes and jump, rope songs that had been passed down through generations of playground wisdom. The little girl laughed with sudden recognition when she heard counting games floating up from the marigolds. Understanding games she had never been taught but somehow knew by heart, Dr. Martinez discovered that the section where medical memories had been planted, stories of healing, and comfort that had accumulated in old instruments and medicine bottles had grown into a patch of chamomile so potent that its tea could ease not just physical ailments, but the deeper aches that came from witnessing too much suffering. He began bringing patients to sit among these gentle flowers, finding that sometimes the most powerful medicine was simply being in the presence of accumulated compassion. Ezra learned to read the garden's moods and needs. With the same intuitive understanding he brought to lost objects, but with a deeper awareness of the living systems at work beneath the surface. He could sense when a section needed more stories to feed its growth, and when it required time to rest and integrate the memories it already held. On foggy mornings, when the world disappeared into silver mystery, he would walk the paths with his hands extended, feeling for places where memories clustered too densely and needed gentle dispersal, like a gardener thinning seedlings to give each plant room to breathe. The garden became what Celeste called their postal service for the heart, a place where lost emotional connections could be sorted, tended, and when the time was right, delivered back to those who needed them. But Ezra was beginning to understand that it was more than a way station for wandering memories. The plants themselves were creating something new, their root systems intertwining beneath the soil to form an underground network of connection and support that mirrored the human community above ground. As autumn painted the coastal hills in familiar shades of amber and rust, Ezra made a discovery that would deepen his understanding of how memory and healing intertwined. While helping Celeste collect seeds for next year's planting, he realized that some of the gathered seeds carried not just the potential for new growth, but the accumulated wisdom of all the memories that had nourished their parent plants. These seeds, when shared with townspeople for their own gardens, would carry forward not individual stories, but the essence of healing itself, the distilled understanding that pain shared becomes more bearable, that joy witnessed multiplies, that love remembered never truly dies. On the first frost of winter, as they walked through the garden collecting the season's final offerings, Ezra found himself surrounded by a landscape that pulsed with gentle life, even as it prepared for dormancy. The memory garden had become a living library of human experience, a place where the essential stories of their community could take root and flourish, ensuring that wisdom wouldn't die with its carriers, but would continue growing, adapting, offering its gifts to whoever had the patience to listen and the courage to plant their own small seeds of hope in the endless, fertile darkness of shared understanding. Standing there in the gathering dusk, with the lighthouse beam beginning its nightly sweep across the harbor, Ezra felt a profound shift in his understanding of his own purpose. He was not just a keeper of lost things, but a tender of the invisible garden that connected all human hearts, the place where memories bloomed into wisdom, where individual sorrows transformed into collective compassion, and where the simple act of witnessing another's story became a form of prayer that could heal wounds deeper than any medicine could reach. The profound understanding that had settled into Ezra's bones that frost-touched evening, that he was a tender of the invisible garden, connecting all human hearts, would soon find its perfect echo in another soul who carried stories like carefully pressed flowers between the pages of her own quiet devotion. As winter gentled into spring and the memory garden began its patient awakening, the lighthouse drew to itself exactly the companion Ezra's expanding gift required. She appeared first as a figure on the harbor wall, during one of those soft April mornings when the world seemed painted in watercolors and whispered promises. Luna sat with her legs dangling toward the tide, holding a small wooden box carved with anchors and compass roses, speaking to its contents in the same reverent tone Celeste used when cataloguing her mason jars of lost things. Her dark hair moved with the salt breeze, and there was something in the careful way she cradled that box that made Ezra pause in his morning walk to the garden, recognizing the particular attention that comes from tending something precious and fragile. She looked up as his shadow fell across the weathered stones, and her eyes held the deep green blue of sea glass, along with the particular gravity of children who have learned too early to be memory keepers for the adults they love. "You're the lighthouse boy," she said, not as a question but as a statement tinged with hope. "The one who helps lost things remember themselves." Her voice carried the musical cadence of her father's homeland, words shaped by the rhythm of waves against distant shores. Ezra settled beside her on the wall, understanding that some conversations require the patience of tides. Luna opened her wooden box with ceremonial care, revealing a collection that made his breath catch with recognition. Inside were dozens of small objects, each wrapped in soft cloth, a brass button green with age, a fishing lure carved from driftwood, a small compass whose needle trembled with remembered directions, a photograph soft at the edges from handling, fragments of rope still holding the memory of important knots. "My father forgets," she said simply, her fingers tracing the compass's worn surface. "Not everything at once, but piece by piece, like sand through fingers. Yesterday he couldn't remember my mother's song. Last week he forgot the name of his first boat. I collect the pieces before they wash away completely." Her voice held no self-pity, only the practical sadness of someone who had accepted a difficult responsibility. With grace beyond her years, Ezra felt recognition bloom in his chest. Here was someone who understood that memories were living things requiring care, that love sometimes meant becoming a bridge between past and present. "Show me," he said quietly, extending his hands in the gesture that had become as natural as breathing. Luna placed the fishing lure in his palms first. Immediately, warmth spread through his fingers as the carved wood shared its story, patient hands shaping each careful cut, love guiding the knife as Captain Esteban carved this gift for his unborn daughter. Countless conversations between father and child during hours spent reading Water and Sky. "He made this while waiting for you," Ezra told her. "He carved it during long nights when your mother couldn't sleep, telling it all the stories he wanted to share with you. They're still there waiting." They spent the morning sharing objects and memories, Luna carefully unwrapping each treasure while Ezra held them until their stories stirred awake. The compass remembered not just magnetic directions, but decades of wisdom accumulated, while navigating storms both literal and metaphorical. The photograph held echoes of music and laughter, the particular joy of two people who had found in each other not just love, but home. The brass button carried a young man's pride as he began his life on the water, heavy with responsibility yet light with untested dreams. With each memory gently restored and returned to its vessel, Luna's shoulders straightened slightly, as if she had been carrying water in a leaking bucket, and someone had finally helped patch the holes. But Ezra sensed something deeper. Luna wasn't collecting memories from desperation alone. She was curating them with intuitive wisdom, understanding that not all memories deserved preservation, that sometimes love meant choosing which stories to keep alive and which to let rest. "There are things I don't save," she admitted as they walked toward the lighthouse. "Arguments, moments when exhaustion made him sharp, times when providing for us felt too heavy. Those can fade, but the songs he hummed while mending nets, his laughter when I caught my first fish, stories about his grandmother, who could predict weather by watching cats walk, those need witnesses." Celeste welcomed Luna with the same recognition she had shown when first finding Ezra sleeping in his basket of seagrass and old letters. She seemed to understand immediately that Luna's gift complemented Ezra's in ways that would strengthen both their abilities to serve their community's healing. While Ezra could feel stories held in objects, Luna possessed an almost supernatural sense, for which memories were ready to be shared, and which needed more time to ripen in patient darkness. That evening, Captain Esteban climbed the lighthouse stairs, his weathered hands gentle on the railing, pride and worry warring in his sun-creased features. He sat quietly in Celeste's kitchen, while Luna and Ezra worked with her wooden box's contents, never asking directly for his memories to return. The particular stubbornness of men accustomed to being strong for others prevented such direct requests. But he listened with the hungry attention of someone starving for the taste of his own life. And when recognition bloomed across his features like sunrise, tears tracked down his cheeks without shame. In Luna, Ezra found not just friendship, but partnership in tending the invisible threads connecting all human experience. Someone who understood their work was less about performing miracles than offering witness to the sacred ordinary moments. That made life worth remembering, the understanding that had settled between Ezra and Luna, that they were partners in tending the invisible threads connecting all human hearts, would soon deepen as Celeste introduced them to perhaps the most delicate aspect of their work. As spring warmed into early summer and the memory garden bloomed with planted stories, she began teaching them that sometimes the greatest kindness lay not in helping someone remember, but in learning when to let go. The lesson arrived on a morning when sea mist clung to the lighthouse like gauze around a wound. Celeste sat with them at the kitchen table, her weathered hands wrapped around a cup of tea that steamed with the scent of chamomile and patience. "Some memories," she said, her voice carrying the wisdom of decades spent watching tides give and take, "are like bright lights held too close to the eyes. They shine so fiercely on a single moment of pain that they blind us to everything else around them." Ezra felt uncertainty bloom in his chest. His gift had always been about restoration, about bringing lost things home to their proper places. The idea of deliberately softening something, of making it less clear, felt almost like betrayal. "But isn't remembering everything, even the difficult parts, how we learn and grow?" he asked, his young voice carrying the weight of genuine concern. Luna, who had spent years watching her father navigate the shifting landscapes of memory, seemed to understand more intuitively. "Sometimes remembering too sharply can trap you," she said thoughtfully. "Like a boat caught on a hidden reef, unable to move forward or back. We're not removing the reef, we're learning how to navigate around it so it doesn't keep tearing holes in the hull. Their opportunity to practice this delicate art arrived that very afternoon when Mrs. Chen climbed the lighthouse stairs carrying a burden heavier than any lost object. The gentle baker, whose thimble had once whispered stories of wedding dresses and hopeful humming, sat in Celeste's kitchen, unable to meet their eyes. Her hands trembled as she spoke of the memory that had begun consuming her days like a bright, relentless flame. It was the morning her son had left for war, the smell of the train station, the sudden weight of their final embrace, the way his hand had lingered against the window as the train pulled away. The memory played with such vivid, agonizing clarity that it had begun to eclipse everything else. His childhood laughter, his off-key humming, the way he helped carry flour sacks with such careful pride. The departure had become a room with only one window, and that window looked out onto an endless, empty platform. Ezra tried his usual approach first, holding a faded photograph and coaxing forth memories of birthday mornings and shared jokes. The photograph pulsed with warmth, the scent of fresh cookies, the sound of delighted laughter, the feeling of small arms wrapped around her neck in fierce affection. But when he offered these gentle memories to Mrs. Chen, the harsh image of the train station simply pushed them aside, asserting its dominance like a lighthouse beam that had forgotten how to dim. Luna watched with the careful attention she brought to reading her father's moods. "It's too bright," she whispered to Ezra. "The memory is cutting through everything else like sunlight through paper." Celeste guided them with patient hands. "We're not trying to erase the train," she explained. "We're trying to wrap that sharp light in something softer, so the love that was always there can shine through more gently." They began not with the departure itself, but with the memories surrounding it. Ezra sat with Mrs. Chen, asking her to describe the texture of her son's favorite sweater, the precise way he hummed when content, the warmth of his presence filling their small kitchen. As she spoke, Ezra held these tender details not to project them back immediately, but to let them mingle with the persistent image of the train like morning mist rising to meet harsh sun. He learned to be like water, letting the raw emotion flow through him without absorbing its sting, gently shaping the memory not by force but by quiet persuasion. He didn't remove the train or deny the pain of separation. Instead, he brought in the scent of her son's favorite pie, the echo of his laughter, the feeling of his embrace, not to replace the goodbye, but to surround it, to give it context, to remind Mrs. Chen that the departure was one moment in a lifetime of love. The process required weeks of patient work, like tending a garden through changing seasons. Gradually, something shifted. One morning, as Mrs. Chen kneaded dough in her bakery, she paused with a soft, distant look in her eyes. When Ezra asked what she was thinking, she smiled, a genuine expression that reached her eyes for the first time in months. "I was remembering the train," she said, her voice light as risen bread. "But this time, I also remembered the picnic we had by the river the day before, the way he made me laugh until my sides ached. It's still sad, yes, but it doesn't hurt quite so much. The sun is still there, but now there are clouds making it gentle." Ezra understood then that Celeste's lesson wasn't about forgetting, but about remembering differently. It was about creating space for healing, allowing grief to exist without consuming all other light. Like knowing when to hold tight and when to open your hands. Trusting that what truly matters will remain, woven into the fabric of who you are, even if its edges are softened by time and tenderness. As summer deepened and the lighthouse beam swept its patient arc across the harbor, Ezra felt his understanding of his gift expand like tide pools, filling with returning water. He was learning that healing sometimes meant helping people release their grip on sharp memories, not to erase the past, but to liberate the present. The work required not just sensitivity to what was lost, but wisdom about what needed to be gently set down, wrapped in compassion, and allowed to rest in the softer light of understanding. Standing in the memory garden that evening, watching Luna tend to plants that held stories of both joy and sorrow, Ezra realized that his role as a keeper of lost things had grown to include being a tender of the spaces between remembering and releasing, helping people find the delicate balance that allows hearts to heal without forgetting how to love. The understanding that healing sometimes meant helping people release their grip on sharp memories would soon find its perfect complement in a woman who arrived with the turning leaves, her cartwheels singing against cobblestones like a melody composed of distant places and collected wisdom. Iris appeared on the first morning, when autumn light turned patient and golden, guiding a handcart that looked like a traveling library, though the books it carried were unlike any Ezra had ever seen. From the lighthouse window, he watched her approach with the same quiet attention he brought to reading the memory garden's moods. The cart was painted in soft blues and greens that shifted like sea glass in sunlight, covered with a canvas roof that rippled in the salt breeze. But it was what spilled from the cart's open compartments that made his breath catch with recognition. Slim volumes bound in worn cloth, glass jars containing rolled papers, small wooden boxes lined with faded silk, and delicate pressed flowers accompanied by tiny, handwritten tags. Luna found him at the window, following his gaze to the unusual visitor. "She carries stories," she whispered, her sea-glass eyes reading the emotional colors that surrounded the approaching figure. There was something about the woman that suggested she held memories not possessively, but with the open-handed generosity of someone who understood that wisdom was meant to flow like water, finding its level. They descended the lighthouse stairs together, drawn by curiosity and the same instinct that had taught them to recognize kindred spirits. Iris was arranging her cart's contents when they approached, her movements efficient but gentle, each book and jar positioned with the ceremonial care of someone tending a sacred collection. "You must be the memory keepers," she said, turning to greet them with eyes that held the deep twilight color of evening skies. Her hair was braided with thin ribbons of various hues, each one carrying the story of a different journey. "I've heard whispers about this lighthouse, about the boy who helps lost things remember themselves, and the girl who sees the colors of the heart. I'm Iris, and I collect memories that people write down and then lose." She led them to her cart with reverent precision. The books that had seemed randomly scattered from a distance revealed themselves to be organized with intuitive understanding. Some were bound in leather soft as skin, others in cloth faded to the color of sea foam. But as Iris began lifting volumes and explaining their contents, Ezra realized these weren't books in any conventional sense. "These contain preserved moments," Iris explained, opening a slim volume bound in blue silk. The pages were filled not with printed text, but with handwriting in dozens of different inks, each entry brief but luminous with captured feeling. "A woman in Portland wrote this while watching her daughter sleep. A fisherman in Nova Scotia recorded this during a storm that taught him something about courage. A baker in Chicago captured this moment of understanding while kneading bread at dawn." She showed them page after page of preserved instants, diary entries found tucked in old books, love letters discovered in coat pockets years after their writers had forgotten composing them, shopping lists that somehow captured entire relationships in their careful notation of shared preferences. These were memories that had been intentionally recorded, given form through ink and paper, then somehow become separated from their authors through the gentle accidents of time and circumstance. Celeste emerged from the lighthouse, drawn by unfamiliar voices, and Ezra watched recognition pass between the two women, like shared understanding that required no words. Within an hour, Iris had been invited to make camp in the meadow beside the memory garden, her cart positioned where the lighthouse beam could sweep over it during its nightly vigil. That evening, as fog began to gather around the lighthouse like a familiar shawl, Iris opened her collection for deeper exploration. She taught Ezra and Luna that written memories existed in layers, like sediment deposited by countless emotional tides. The surface layer consisted of deliberate recordings, diary entries, letters, careful documentation of important events. But beneath these lay something more precious, the accidental captures, moments so pure and essential that they had imprinted themselves on paper through the simple act of being witnessed. "Look at this," she said, showing them a grocery list written in fading pencil. To most eyes it would appear mundane. Milk, eggs, flour, the careful notation of a household's needs. But when Ezra held it, he felt the profound tenderness behind each item. A mother planning meals for a family she loved, each ingredient chosen with care. The list itself a small prayer for the ordinary abundance that makes life possible. Iris showed them how to read between the lines, to sense the emotional weather that had surrounded each moment of recording. A shopping list written during illness carried different energy than one composed in joy. Love letters bore the specific gravity of their particular season. The Ophitu, breathless excitement of new romance felt entirely different from the steady warmth of decades-long partnership. She taught them that some preserved moments were meant to return to their original writers, if such people could be found. The others were intended to travel, carrying lessons that would make sense only in strangers' hands, like messages in bottles thrown into the vast ocean of human experience. And still others were meant to rest in collections like hers, available to anyone who needed to remember that their own small moments of beauty and understanding were part of a vast, interconnected web of human awareness. Under her guidance, Ezra began to understand that his gift extended beyond helping people reconnect with their own lost memories. He was also a curator of the collective human experience, helping to ensure that wisdom didn't die with its carriers, but continued flowing from heart to heart, generation to generation, like the lighthouse beam that had guided countless souls safely through darkness. As autumn deepened and the lighthouse beam swept across increasingly longer nights, Iris became their mentor in understanding that memories were living things requiring not just preservation, but circulation. Standing in the memory garden surrounded by plants that held stories, and a woman who collected the written remnants of human awareness, Ezra felt his understanding of his purpose expand once again into something vast and tender and essential. Expanding understanding of his purpose as a curator of the collective human experience would soon test Ezra in ways that neither Celeste's patient teachings nor Iris's gentle wisdom had prepared him for. As winter settled over the lighthouse with its familiar weight of salt and silence, something began to shift in the delicate balance of his gift. The sorrows he encountered, each one held with such careful attention, each story witnessed with such open-hearted compassion, began to accumulate like fog gathering in the deepest hollows of the coast. Soft at first, then so thick he forgot there had ever been clear horizons. It started as whispers in his sleep, fragments of other people's dreams drifting through his own. Mrs. Patterson's loneliness after her husband's passing would seep into his chest during quiet moments. Captain Rodriguez's regret over harsh words spoken to his son settled into his shoulders like stones he couldn't set down. The weight of accumulated grief pressed against his ribs with each breath, and the lighthouse stairs that had always welcomed his feet now seemed to stretch endlessly upward, each step requiring effort that left him breathless. Luna noticed first, her gift for reading emotional colors, revealing the subtle shift in the light that surrounded him. Where once his presence had glowed with the warm amber of someone comfortable in his purpose, now there were threads of pewter gray woven through, not the gentle silver of moonlight, but the heavy color of storm clouds that refused to release their rain. She found him one morning sitting in the memory garden, surrounded by dormant plants that pulsed with their stored stories, his hands pressed flat against the frost-covered earth, as if trying to anchor himself against some invisible current. "You're holding too much," she said, settling beside him, with the same careful attention she brought to her father's confused moments. "The colors around you are crowding together, like every sorrow wants to sit in your chair at once. We need more chairs. We need windows open." Ezra tried to explain what was happening, but the words felt clumsy in his mouth. How could he describe the way he could feel every planted memory in the garden simultaneously? Every story of loss transformed into lavender, every whispered goodbye that had become part of the soil. He wasn't just witnessing these stories anymore. He was absorbing them, becoming a repository for pain that belonged to dozens of other hearts. Celeste found them there as the pale winter sun climbed higher, bringing with her the warmth of understanding, born from decades of tending both lighthouse and human hearts. She settled on his other side, creating a circle of care around his struggling spirit. "You're trying to be a container," she said gently, her weathered hands finding his cold ones, "when what you need to be is a conduit." That evening, as stars appeared in the clear winter sky, the three women who had become his guides, Celeste, Luna, and Iris, gathered around him in the lighthouse kitchen. Iris spread her traveling cloak like gathered twilight, and in its folds, she revealed small objects that seemed to pulse with their own gentle light: a shallow bowl carved from driftwood, smooth stones worn by countless tides, sprigs of herbs that carried the scent of distant shores. "Water doesn't become the stones it flows over," Celeste explained, placing the driftwood bowl on the table and filling it with seawater that caught the lamplight like liquid stars. It shapes them gently over time, and they give it direction. But the water remains water, always moving, always returning to its source. Iris taught him rituals for opening windows in his heart. She showed him how to trail his fingers through the salt water, after listening to someone's ache, how the ocean's memory could help carry what didn't belong to him back to the vast, accepting sea. Salt remembers the ocean, she told him, her voice low and certain. And the ocean remembers how to carry weight without breaking. Luna contributed her own understanding, born from years of caring for her father without losing herself in his confusion. When Papa forgets my name, she said, I don't try to become his memory. I stay Luna and offer what I can from that place of being myself, not from trying to be everything he's lost. They taught him 3 breaths to keep in his pocket, each with a name: arrive, witness, return. Arrive means feel your feet on solid ground, Iris explained, tapping the worn wooden boards beneath them. Witness means see the person and not just their storm. Return means place what isn't yours back in the bowl. You can love what you don't keep. Celeste placed a small woven basket by the door, filled with smooth stones worn by countless tides. 1 for each story, she said. When you begin, choose a stone and hold it. When you finish, set it outside on the step. The world will keep what you don't need to carry. The practice required weeks of patient work, like learning to speak a new language or training muscles that had never been properly used. Ezra had to unlearn his instinct to gather and hold, replacing it with the more delicate skill of receiving and releasing. He practiced with simple objects first: a child's lost mitten, a fountain pen that had run dry, learning to let their stories flow through him like light through clear glass, witnessing and honoring without possessing. The first real test came with a radio that hummed old songs even when switched off. Its owner, a widower named Harlan, climbed the lighthouse stairs slowly, carrying the radio against his chest like a sleeping child. It won't stop playing our station, he said, his voice thick with exhaustion. Every night the songs find me, but I can't find sleep. Ezra reached for his feet on the plank floor. Arrive. He looked at Harlan, not past him to the sorrow that surrounded him like fog. Witness. He placed one hand lightly on the radio and the other near the salt bowl, feeling the decade of evenings the device carried. The clink of ice in glasses, 2 sets of footsteps in a kitchen where the floor tilted slightly toward the sea, love that filled the air like steam. Instead of absorbing the weight of loss, he let it flow through him like water through a channel, keeping only what served the healing. The radio's song softened to a gentle murmur, enough for memory, not enough to drown the present. When Harlan lifted it again, something had shifted. She loved the late ones, he said, smiling a private smile. I think I can let the night be night. Return. As winter began its slow retreat toward spring, Ezra felt his gift settling into its mature form. He learned to be like the lighthouse itself, rooted in solid ground, reaching toward sky, offering steady illumination without being consumed by the darkness it helped others navigate. The sorrows he encountered would always touch him, but now they flowed through him like tides, leaving behind only the salt-sweet wisdom that comes from understanding that love and loss are 2 faces of the same eternal truth. Standing in the memory garden as the first green shoots pushed through frost-softened soil, Ezra felt the accumulated weight lifting from his chest, like morning mist rising to meet the sun. He was learning to be what Iris called a sacred witness, someone who could hold space for others' pain without making it their own, who could offer the gift of deep listening without drowning in the stories they heard. The lighthouse beam that swept across the harbor each night had become his meditation, a reminder that his purpose was not to absorb all the darkness he encountered, but to offer steady light that could guide others safely through their own storms, trusting that dawn would always follow, bringing with it the gentle promise of renewal, the wisdom of learning to be a sacred witness, someone who could hold space for others' pain without drowning in their stories, settled into Ezra's bones as spring returned with its patient green fingers. As he walked through the awakening memory garden, practicing the rhythm that had become as natural as breathing, arrive witness, a return, he felt the profound stillness that comes not from emptiness but from perfect balance. The townspeople sensed this shift, like sailors reading changes in the wind. And their visits to the lighthouse took on a different quality, less urgent seeking and more gentle communion. Luna noticed it first, her gift for reading emotional colors, revealing how the pewter-gray threads that had once crowded around Ezra had transformed into something like morning light, filtered through sea glass. She found him one April morning sitting among the dormant rosemary, his hands resting easily on the earth, no longer trying to anchor himself against invisible currents, but simply present with whatever wanted to be known. "The whole town is different," she said, settling beside him with the same careful attention she brought to her father's confused moments. "People walk lighter, but they also walk more carefully, like they understand their steps matter. I think we're ready for something bigger." Her words carried the musical cadence that had become as familiar as waves against stone. But underneath was something new, a certainty that made Ezra look up with sudden attention. Luna's eyes held the deep green blue of sea glass, and in them he saw not just observation but vision. That evening, as fog began to gather around the lighthouse like a familiar shawl, the four of them, Celeste, Luna, Iris, and Ezra, found themselves drawn to the kitchen table where so many individual healings had taken place. Celeste poured tea that steamed with the scent of chamomile and new beginnings, while Iris spread her traveling cloak like gathered twilight, revealing small treasures that seemed to pulse with gentle anticipation. "What if," Luna said, tracing patterns on the worn wooden table, "we created a space where the whole community could bring their forgotten things together? Not one by one, but all at once, like a celebration of how we've learned to remember and release?" The idea took root like seeds finding fertile soil. Celeste's weathered hands stilled on her teacup as understanding bloomed across her features. "A festival," she said softly, "for all the names that have been waiting to come home." Iris nodded, her twilight eyes bright with recognition. "In other places I've traveled, communities that learn to tend their collective memory often create such gatherings. Not somber occasions of loss, but celebrations of the courage it takes to remain open-hearted. They called it the Festival of Forgotten Names, and the planning unfolded with the same organic patience that characterized everything important in their small coastal town. Celeste worked with the craftspeople to create wooden tokens carved with symbols of remembering, spirals for stories that came full circle, waves for memories that ebbed and flowed, stars for moments that provided guidance. Luna collaborated with her father and the fishermen to string lights that would transform the harbor into a constellation of welcome. Iris contributed songs from distant places where communities celebrated their shared stories, melodies that reminded everyone that witnessing each other's experiences was one of humanity's oldest sacred arts. She also brought special papers made from pressed flowers, explaining that some memories were meant to be written down and released, like prayers into the wind. The morning of the festival dawned clear and bright, with light that made everything look newly created. People began arriving before noon, carrying objects wrapped in soft cloth, their faces luminous with anticipation. The lighthouse meadow transformed into a series of gentle alcoves formed by draped sheets and flowering shrubs, each space holding the particular quiet that invites revelation. Ezra sat at a long wooden table with Luna beside him, the familiar driftwood bowl of salt water and basket of smooth stones between them. He felt centered in a way that would have seemed impossible during his winter of accumulated sorrows. Present, but not overwhelmed. Open, but not drowning. Mrs. Patterson approached first, carrying a brass thimble green with age. When Ezra held it, he felt the familiar warmth flow through him like water through a clear channel, keeping only what served the healing. "She made wedding dresses during the war," he told her gently. "Each stitch was a prayer that love would be strong enough to last through whatever storms were coming." Mrs. Patterson wept with the joy of suddenly remembering her grandmother's voice threading hope through difficult years. A fisherman brought a compass, whose needle trembled with remembered directions. As Ezra cradled it, he felt not just magnetic pull but decades of wisdom accumulated while navigating storms both literal and metaphorical. "It guided more than ships," he said. "It carried the knowledge that true direction comes from knowing what you're sailing toward, not just what you're sailing away from." Luna moved through the gathering like a gentle conductor, her ability to read emotional colors helping her guide people toward the stories they most needed to hear. She could sense when someone was ready to release a burden or reclaim a forgotten joy, creating perfect conditions for healing, like a gardener who knows exactly when soil is ready for planting. As afternoon mellowed into evening, the lighthouse beam began its patient sweep across a harbor transformed by accumulated stories. Each revelation wove into a tapestry of shared understanding, individual experiences recognized as part of a larger narrative of human resilience and love. Dr. Martinez discovered his father's stethoscope still worked, just listening to different hearts now, hearts that had stopped beating but left their rhythm in the metal. A child's toy soldier revealed itself as a talisman, carved by a grandfather, who survived battles by keeping love alive in his heart. A woman's grandmother's thimble whispered lullabies that had been hummed over countless cradles. Standing on the lighthouse steps as the last visitors departed, carrying objects now reunited with their stories, Ezra felt the profound satisfaction that comes from work serving something larger than oneself. The Festival of Forgotten Names had become more than celebration. It was declaration that their community would be a place where stories mattered, where memories were tended with care, where the courage to remain open-hearted was honored as the sacred act it truly was. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor with its eternal patience, and Ezra understood that he was part of something vast and tender and essential, a living network of care that ensured no story would be lost. No heart would carry its burdens alone. The profound satisfaction that had settled over the lighthouse after the Festival of Forgotten Names would soon deepen into something even more precious as Luna's own unique abilities began to bloom, revealing themselves as the perfect counterpoint to Ezra's gentle touch. In the quiet weeks that followed their community celebration, as townspeople continued arriving with objects that had lost their stories, Luna discovered she could see what Ezra could only feel, the emotional colors that memories carried, like invisible light. It began with small recognitions that accumulated like morning dew gathering on seagrass. While sorting through a box of forgotten photographs left at the lighthouse, Ezra held a sepia-toned image of a young couple laughing on a swing. He felt the warmth of their joy, the breathless anticipation of a shared future, but also a faint tremor of sorrow threading through the happiness like a minor key in a major chord. Luna reached out, placing her hand lightly over his, her sea-glass eyes softening as she gazed at the photograph. "It's a vibrant green," she murmured, "like new leaves after rain, but there's a faint violet around the edges, like the last light of dusk. It wants to be remembered for its beginning, for the promise, but it also understands the quiet wisdom of what couldn't be." The revelation settled between them like a bridge, finally completing its span. Ezra had always felt the stories, but Luna could articulate their emotional temperature, their specific shade of being. She could distinguish between the sharp, urgent red of anger, ready to be acknowledged, and the soft, faded blue of gentle sorrow, needing only compassionate witness. She saw the bright, hopeful yellow of childhood dreams and the deep, rich indigo of wisdom earned through long years. Their partnership transformed into a dance of intuitive understanding. When Captain Rodriguez brought his father's compass, Ezra felt decades of navigation through storms, both literal and metaphorical. Luna watched the object with careful attention, then said quietly, "It carries steady amber light, warm as lantern flame. This one knows its purpose and is ready to share its guidance." Together, they helped the old fisherman understand that the compass remembered not just magnetic directions, but the accumulated wisdom of knowing that true navigation comes from understanding what you're sailing toward, not just what you're sailing away from. Captain Rodriguez left with tears of gratitude. The compass clutched against his chest like recovered treasure. For a woman struggling with a harsh memory of her father's disappointed words, Ezra felt the sharp sting of the moment, the echoes of judgment that had lingered for decades. But Luna saw that the memory itself wasn't angry red, but a dull, bruised purple, pain that had stagnated and was ready to be gently moved rather than confronted. Working together, they helped the woman find the underlying love that had always been there, hidden beneath layers of misunderstanding, allowing the memory to soften into quiet, wistful blue. Celeste watched their collaboration with the quiet satisfaction of someone who had tended both lighthouse and human souls long enough to recognize love in its many forms. She found them one morning working in perfect synchronization, Luna identifying which memories were ready to be shared, while Ezra provided the gentle touch that helped them settle into their proper places. "You've become something beautiful together," Celeste told them as they shared evening tea. "Not just partners in the work, but partners in the way you hold space for each other's growth." Their courtship unfolded with the same patient attention they brought to tending memories. They learned each other's languages of care, how Luna needed quiet mornings to process the emotional colors she absorbed, how Ezra required evening walks to release the weight of stories that didn't belong to him. They discovered that their individual healing practices strengthened when shared, that the rituals Celeste and Iris had taught them became more powerful when witnessed by someone who understood their necessity. The townspeople noticed the deepening of their bond with quiet approval. Mrs. Chen brought them a special cake for no particular occasion except the general celebration of watching two souls discover they belonged together. Dr. Martinez commented that the quality of healing in their community had deepened since Ezra and Luna had learned to work not just alongside each other, but as extensions of each other's compassion. Spring arrived with its familiar promise of renewal, and Luna began spending more nights at the lighthouse, her presence as natural as the tide's return. They created new rhythms together, morning tea shared while watching sunrise paint the harbor in shades of pearl and gold, evening conversations in the memory garden where they could feel the accumulated stories pulsing gently in the soil beneath their feet. Their love was not a sudden, fiery thing, but something that grew with the quiet strength of an ancient tree, its roots intertwining deeper with each passing season. It was built on shared purpose, on the unspoken language of understanding that flowed between them, on mutual reverence for the tender complexities of life and the delicate art of tending human hearts. On quiet evenings when fog wrapped the lighthouse like a familiar shawl, they would sit together in the lantern room, watching the great lens cast its patient light through the mist. Ezra didn't always understand Luna's words in the way one understands a book, but he understood her heart, felt its rhythm align with his own like two distant lighthouses, finding their shared beam. Standing together in the memory garden, as the lighthouse beam swept across their work, Ezra and Luna felt their individual purposes weaving together into something stronger and more beautiful than either could have created alone. They were still themselves, he the boy who helped lost things remember, she the girl who saw the colors of the heart, but they were also something new, a partnership that would deepen their ability to serve their communities, healing while creating their own sanctuary of mutual understanding and shared wonder, the partnership that had deepened between Ezra and Luna through the Festival of Forgotten names. Their combined ability to read both the stories held in lost objects and the emotional colors that surrounded them had created a rhythm of healing that pulsed through their community like a gentle heartbeat. But even the most sheltered harbors can feel the distant pressure of approaching storms, and on a morning when the tide lay so still it seemed to be holding its breath, something unfamiliar touched the edges of their carefully tended world. Ezra noticed it first in the quality of silence that had settled over the harbor. Even the gulls held their wings quieter than usual, and the lighthouse beam from the previous night seemed to linger in the salt air like a question waiting for an answer. Luna found him at the memory garden, her sea-glass eyes tracking something invisible in the distance, her gift for reading emotional colors, revealing disturbances that hadn't yet taken physical form. "There's something bright coming," she said, settling beside him among the rosemary that held stories of family wisdom. "But it's the wrong kind of bright. Like sunlight reflected off a blade, beautiful but sharp enough to cut." The source of her unease arrived by mid-morning in a carriage that seemed too polished for their weathered coastal roads. The man who emerged moved with theatrical precision, his coat stitched with tiny mirrors that caught the light and scattered it in appealing fragments across the faces of those who watched him. He set up his operation in the town square with the confidence of someone accustomed to being the center of attention, arranging glass cases that contained what appeared to be liquid light, some golden and warm, others silver bright, a few that pulsed with colors that had no earthly names. "I am Silas," he announced to the gathering crowd, his voice carrying the smooth authority of polished riverstone. "I am a merchant of memories, and I have come to offer you freedom from the weight of sorrow, release from the burden of difficult remembrances. Why carry pain when you can trade it for joy? Why cling to regret when you can possess moments of pure, unblemished happiness?" Ezra felt unease bloom in his chest, like a flower opening to poisoned rain. He reached for the familiar rhythm that had become as natural as breathing. Arrive, witness, return. But something about the merchant's presence made it difficult to find solid ground. Luna moved closer, her hand finding his, and through their connection he felt her reading the emotional colors that surrounded the stranger. "They're not real," she whispered, her voice carrying the certainty of someone who had learned to trust her gift completely. The colors around him shift like oil on water, never settling into authentic feeling. And those lights in his cases, they're beautiful but they're hollow, like shells from which the living creature has been carefully removed. Silas began his demonstration with the practiced showmanship of someone who had performed this routine in countless towns. He selected Mrs. Patterson from the crowd, the gentle woman who still carried the softened ache of her husband's passing, despite the healing she had found through her grandmother's thimble. From his collection, he chose a vial of golden liquid that seemed to dance with its own inner light. "This contains the pure essence of a bride's joy on her wedding morning," Silas explained, his voice warm as honey over steel, untainted by the knowledge of what time might bring, unmarked by any shadow of loss. "Drink this and trade away the gray weight you carry. Feel only the brightness of love that never learned to grieve." Ezra descended from the lighthouse steps with Luna close behind, both of them drawn by an instinct that felt like standing between a child and an approaching storm. They reached Mrs. Patterson just as she lifted the vial to her lips, her face luminous with desperate hope. "Mrs. Patterson," Ezra said quietly, placing his hand gently on her wrist, not to stop her forcefully, but to offer her a moment of pause, a breath in which to consider. "May I hold your husband's wedding ring for just a moment?" She fumbled for the simple gold band she wore on a chain around her neck, placing it in Ezra's palm with the trust born from months of witnessed healing. The ring pulsed with accumulated stories, arguments that had been forgiven, laughter shared over morning coffee, the particular tenderness of two people learning to age together gracefully. "Your love was real," Ezra told her, his voice carrying the same gentle attention he brought to tending lost memories. "All of it. The joy and the sorrow, the easy days and the difficult ones. If you trade away the sadness, you'll lose the depth that makes your love precious. The gray you carry isn't just loss, it's the shadow that proves your joy was real." Silas's practiced smile flickered like a candle in wind. "Don't listen to children playing with trinkets," he said, his voice taking on an edge that cut through his polished charm. "I offer you freedom from pain, release from the burden of difficult memories. These young people want to keep you trapped in your suffering." Luna stepped forward, her gift allowing her to see what others couldn't, the way the merchant's borrowed feelings shifted and changed like smoke, never settling into authentic experience. "Show us your own memories," she said, her voice carrying quiet challenge. "If trading memories is such a gift, what stories do you carry? What joys and sorrows have shaped you into who you are?" The question hung in the salt air like fog refusing to lift. Silas reached for his collection with movements that suddenly seemed less confident, more desperate. But when Ezra extended his hand toward one of the luminous orbs, a bright, sparkling sphere that Silas claimed held the memory of a perfect first kiss, he felt only superficial sheen, manufactured glow. There was no depth, no echo of nervous anticipation, no faint scent of springtime, no understanding of two hearts beating wildly beneath the surface. Iris emerged from the crowd, her traveling cloak rippling like gathered twilight, her presence carrying the authority of someone who had witnessed countless attempts to shortcut the patient work of healing. "I've seen his kind before," she said, her voice carrying the weight of accumulated wisdom. "They promise to take away pain, but they don't understand that authentic healing comes not from trading away difficult experiences, but from learning to hold them with compassion." Over the following days, as Silas continued his demonstrations, and more townspeople found themselves tempted by his gleaming promises, Ezra and Luna began working quietly through their community. They didn't argue against the merchant directly, but instead asked gentle questions that helped people examine what they might truly be losing. "Captain Esteban, who had considered trading his lingering guilt over a past mistake for a moment of unblemished triumph, spent an afternoon with them in the memory garden. As they sat among the plants that held stories of both joy and sorrow, he began to understand that his guilt, however uncomfortable, had taught him patience and humility, making him a better man and a wiser captain. Dr. Martinez, tempted to exchange the exhaustion of losing patience for memories of effortless success, realized that the ache of failure was what fueled his compassion and drove him to learn more, to try harder. Mrs. Chen discovered that even the softened memory of her son's departure, painful as it remained, was inseparable from the depth of love that made their relationship precious. As understanding rippled through the community, Silas's collection began to seem less appealing and more hollow. People started to see that their sorrows, like their joys, were part of what made them beautifully, completely human. To give them away was not to become lighter, but to become less. To lose pieces of the intricate, unique mosaic that was their own life story. On his final morning in town, Silas packed his gleaming cases with quiet efficiency that revealed a flicker of something that might have been disappointment, or perhaps relief. He had made few sales, and those who had initially traded memories began returning, asking for their authentic experiences back, preferring the full spectrum of their emotional landscape to the artificial brightness he had offered. As his carriage disappeared down the coastal road, the townspeople gathered around the lighthouse with a deeper understanding of what they had almost lost. They began to see that authentic healing was not a transaction, but a journey, a patient tending of the heart that allowed all its seasons, storms and sunshine, wilting and blooming, to contribute to the rich, complex beauty of a life fully lived. Standing together in the memory garden that evening, watching the lighthouse beam sweep across water that reflected stars like scattered promises, Ezra and Luna felt their understanding of their work deepen once again. They were not just keepers of lost memories, but guardians of authentic experience, helping their community understand that the courage to remain open-hearted in the face of both joy and sorrow was perhaps the most sacred act of all. The empty spaces where Silas's artificial lights had briefly shone now seemed to pulse with something more valuable. The quiet strength of people who had chosen depth over ease, truth over comfort, the full spectrum of human feeling over its pale imitation, the understanding that their community had chosen depth over ease, truth over comfort, would soon find its most tender expression, as the woman who had taught Ezra everything about tending lost memories began her own gentle journey into forgetting. Celeste's retreat from the sharp edges of remembrance arrived like morning mist gathering at the harbor's edge, barely noticeable at first, then slowly transforming the familiar landscape into something soft and strange and new. It began with small hesitations that could have belonged to anyone. Celeste would reach for the sugar bowl and pause, her weathered hand hovering in the salt-thick air as if the object had moved just beyond the borders of certainty. She would begin cataloguing a lost earring, her voice carrying its familiar authority, then drift into silence while her eyes searched for words that had wandered just out of reach like gulls riding distant currents. Ezra noticed these moments with the same careful attention. He brought to reading the needs of forgotten objects, but without the certainty that had always guided his understanding of how to help. Luna saw it first in colors, her gift revealing subtle shifts in the light that had always surrounded Celeste like a gentle aura. Where once there had been steady amber, the warm glow of accumulated wisdom and purposeful work, now there were patches of pearl gray, soft and luminous but somehow unmoored, like clouds that had forgotten their way back to the sky. The changes continued with the patience of tides, each small shift barely noticeable until viewed from the perspective of weeks passing like pages in a familiar book, whose words were slowly fading. Celeste would begin stories about her decades tending the lighthouse, her voice rich with the particular satisfaction that comes from work, serving something larger than oneself. But the endings would drift away like smoke, leaving her staring out at the harbor with eyes that held questions she couldn't quite formulate. On a morning when autumn light turned patient and golden, Celeste stood in her kitchen, holding a teacup with the careful attention of someone encountering a beautiful but unfamiliar object. "This is lovely," she said to Ezra, her voice carrying genuine appreciation. "Did someone leave it for us to catalogue? It feels important, but I can't quite remember why. The teacup had been her daily companion for 27 years, its handle worn smooth by countless mornings of watching sunrise paint the harbor in shades of pearl and promise. Ezra felt his heart contract with the particular ache that comes from witnessing someone lose pieces of themselves. But Luna's presence beside him offered steadiness like an anchor in uncertain waters. His first instinct, honed by years of helping others reclaim what they had lost, was to restore what seemed misplaced. He could guide her through the memory of purchasing the cup, help her reconnect with the thousands of quiet mornings it had witnessed. But as he reached for his familiar rhythm, arrive witness return, something stopped him. This wasn't about a memory that had wandered away and needed finding. This was about a different kind of journey entirely. Luna touched his hand gently, her sea-glass eyes reflecting understanding that came from years of watching her father navigate the shifting landscapes of memory. "She's not losing herself," Luna whispered. "She's entering a different kind of presence, one that lives more in feeling than in facts." They learned to meet Celeste where she was, rather than trying to pull her back to where she had been. When she forgot Ezra's name, calling him instead the boy who helps things remember, he discovered that being seen for his essence rather than his identity felt oddly freeing. When she couldn't recall the specific process for cataloging lost objects, but continued arranging them with intuitive care, they understood that some knowledge lived deeper than memory, in the hands and heart, rather, than the mind. The townspeople responded with the same gentle adaptation they had shown when learning to tend their collective memories. Mrs. Chen began bringing not just lost objects, but fresh bread, understanding that Celeste's forgetting created different kinds of hunger. Dr. Martinez visited not as someone seeking help with medical mysteries held in old instruments, but simply to sit quietly in the lighthouse kitchen, offering his presence as a gift that required no reciprocation. Captain Esteban taught Ezra something profound about love that doesn't depend on recognition. During one of Celeste's increasingly frequent periods of confusion, when she looked at the lighthouse as if seeing it for the first time, the old fisherman sat with her on the steps and began describing the building's beauty with the wonder of a first-time visitor. "Look how the light catches the glass," he said, his voice warm with authentic appreciation. "Someone must have tended this place with great love to make it shine so beautifully." Celeste's face lit up with the particular joy that comes from sharing wonder with someone who truly sees. In that moment, Ezra understood that love could exist independent of memory. That connection lived not in the ability to recall shared history, but in the quality of attention brought to each present moment. As winter approached with its familiar weight of salt and silence, Ezra realized that caring for Celeste was teaching him the final lesson in his education as a keeper of lost things. He was learning that sometimes the most profound act of love was not trying to restore what had been lost, but learning to be present with what remained, offering companionship to someone navigating the mysterious territory between remembering and forgetting. Standing in the memory garden on the first frost of winter, watching Celeste move among the dormant plants with the careful attention of someone encountering daily miracles, Ezra felt his understanding of his gift expand once more. He was not just a tender of lost memories, but a companion to souls in transition, someone who could offer steady presence to those learning to navigate the shifting landscapes of the heart, trusting that love would find its own way of expressing itself, even when the familiar paths became strange and new. The understanding that love could exist independent of memory, that connection lived in the quality of attention brought to each present moment, would soon bloom into something that transformed not just how Ezra and Luna tended to their community's healing, but how the townspeople understood the very nature of happiness itself. As they learned to be present with Celeste's gentle journey into forgetting, they began to notice something profound. While their work had always focused on returning lost sorrows to their proper places, they had never intentionally gathered the small, essential moments of joy that made life worth living. The revelation arrived on a morning when early spring light painted the memory garden in shades of pearl and promise. Celeste sat among the awakening plants, her weathered hands resting on the soil above the dormant rosemary, her face luminous with the particular wonder that had begun to characterize her days. "These remember being happy," she said, her voice carrying the clear certainty that sometimes emerged from her confusion like stars appearing through clearing clouds. Not sad things that happened to them, but the feeling of being exactly where they belonged, doing exactly what they were meant to do. Luna looked up from sketching the emotional colors that surrounded the sleeping herbs, her sea-glass eyes bright with sudden understanding. She could see it now, the warm amber glow that pulsed gently beneath the soil, different from the stored memories of specific events they had planted there. This was accumulated contentment, the distilled essence of countless perfect moments when the plants had simply existed in harmony with sun and rain and earth. "She's right," Luna whispered to Ezra. "There's a different kind of memory here, one we've never learned to tend. It's not about things that were lost and found again. It's about moments of pure contentment that exist all around us, waiting to be noticed and preserved." That evening, as fog gathered around the lighthouse like a familiar shawl, they sat in the kitchen with Iris, while Celeste arranged and rearranged her collection of smooth stones, each placement bringing her visible satisfaction. Watching her find joy in such simple ordering, Ezra felt understanding bloom in his chest like a flower opening to morning light. "What if," he said slowly, "we created a special collection for these moments? Not dramatic happiness, but the quiet contentment that lives in ordinary things, the taste of perfectly ripe fruit, the feeling of clean sheets, the sound of rain on a roof when you're safe inside." The idea took root with the same organic patience that characterized everything important in their work. They began by asking the townspeople to notice their own small joys, to pay attention to moments when contentment settled over them like sunlight through clear water. But gathering these moments required different techniques than those Ezra had learned for working with lost objects. Joy, they discovered, was more delicate than sorrow, more likely to slip away if grasped too tightly. Luna's gift for reading emotional colors proved essential in learning to recognize authentic contentment. She could distinguish between the bright, urgent yellow of excitement, happiness that burned hot and fast, and the deeper, more sustainable gold of genuine satisfaction. She saw how forced cheerfulness appeared, as harsh orange light, while true joy glowed with the warm amber of honey held up to sunlight. They started with objects that had witnessed small joys, a well-worn cookbook that had guided countless successful meals, a rocking chair that had soothed generations of restless children, a compass that had participated in perfect mornings when work and weather aligned in harmony. When Ezra held these items, he felt not specific memories, but the accumulated essence of contentment, like distilled sunshine that could be shared with anyone who needed reminding that happiness was possible. Mrs. Chen brought a wooden spoon smooth from decades of stirring, explaining that the rhythm of cooking had become her meditation. "When I hold this," she said, "I remember not any particular meal, but the feeling of feeding people I love, of making something nourishing with my own hands." When Ezra touched the spoon, warmth spread through his palms, not the sharp heat of urgency, but the steady glow of purpose fulfilled. Captain Esteban contributed a small brass button from his first fishing jacket, worn smooth by countless mornings when he had dressed before dawn to meet the sea. "It holds the feeling of beginning," he said simply, "of walking toward work that matters, breathing air that tastes like possibility." The button pulsed with quiet anticipation, the particular joy of someone who had found their calling. Dr. Martinez brought a stethoscope that had been present during moments of healing. When pain finally eased and hope returned to worried faces, "It remembers relief," he explained, "the exact instant when suffering transforms into gratitude, when fear becomes trust." The instrument carried the profound satisfaction of service, of being present for others' most vulnerable moments. Celeste, despite her increasing confusion about specific details, possessed an almost supernatural ability to recognize these vessels of preserved joy. She would reach for them with the same intuitive certainty she had once brought to cataloging lost objects, her weathered hands somehow knowing which items held the particular warmth that could comfort troubled hearts. As the collection grew, they realized the archive of small joys had become something more than a repository. It was a living library of what it meant to be human and content, proof that happiness was not a rare treasure, but a daily possibility available to anyone who learned to notice it. The townspeople began visiting not just when they had lost something, but when they needed reminding of what they still possessed. A mother overwhelmed by caring for young children would hold a smooth stone that had absorbed decades of peaceful mornings, feeling her shoulders relax as she remembered that chaos was temporary but love was permanent. An elderly man struggling with loneliness would cradle a teacup that had witnessed countless friendly conversations, understanding that connection was always possible for those willing to open their hearts. Standing in the memory garden as the lighthouse beams swept across their expanded work, Ezra felt his understanding of his purpose deepen once more. He was not just a keeper of lost sorrows, but a curator of preserved joys, helping his community understand that healing meant not only releasing pain but actively cultivating the capacity for wonder, gratitude, and the quiet satisfaction that came from being fully present to the gift of ordinary life. The archive of small joys became their community's reminder that happiness, like sorrow, deserved witnesses and caretakers, that the small moments of contentment were not insignificant but sacred, not fleeting but eternal when held with proper attention and shared with generous hearts. In learning to tend joy as carefully as they tended grief, they discovered that both were essential threads in the tapestry of human experience, each making the other more precious, more real, more worthy of the patient love that makes all healing possible. The archive of small joys had become their community's reminder that happiness deserved witnesses and caretakers. But as spring warmed into early summer, and the lighthouse beam swept across another season's turning, something new began to stir in the salt-thick air. Young people had started appearing at the lighthouse with increasing frequency, drawn not by lost objects but by something deeper, a hunger to understand how hearts could be tended with the same careful attention that gardeners brought to growing things. The first to arrive was Ilara, a girl of perhaps 15, whose hands were always stained with berry juice and whose eyes held the deep, reflective gaze of someone who listened to things others couldn't hear. She climbed the lighthouse stairs on a morning when sea mist clung to the harbor, like gauze around a wound, carrying in her palm a single piece of sea glass, smooth and luminous as captured moonlight. "It's not lost," she explained, settling beside Ezra on the lighthouse steps, with the careful attention of someone trying not to disturb something fragile. "But I feel it has a story it wants to tell, and I don't quite know how to listen. My grandmother says you help things remember themselves. Could you teach me to do the same?" Ezra felt recognition bloom in his chest like a flower opening to morning light. Here was someone standing where he had once stood, drawn by the same mysterious pull that had always brought seekers to the lighthouse. Luna joined them, her sea-glass eyes reading the emotional colors that surrounded Ilara, deep indigo curiosity threaded with silver hope, the particular combination that appeared around hearts ready to serve something larger than themselves. They began not with techniques or rituals, but with the fundamental understanding that had taken Ezra years to fully grasp. He taught her the 3 breaths to keep in her pocket: arrive, witness, return, showing her how to find solid ground before attempting to help someone else navigate uncertain territory. "Feel your feet on the lighthouse steps," he said gently. "Breathe with the rhythm of the waves. The most important tool is a heart that can remain open without being overwhelmed." When Ilara finally closed her eyes and held the sea glass with the proper attention, understanding flowed between them like water, finding its level. The smooth fragment spoke of countless waves, of the slow, patient shaping of rough edges into something luminous and whole, of resilience found in the heart of endless motion. She opened her eyes not with surprise, but with the quiet satisfaction of having learned a secret language. Other young people followed, drawn by the same mysterious current. Maya arrived carrying the weight of her grandmother's angry forgetting, not the gentle drift that characterized Celeste's journey, but a fierce, fighting confusion that left everyone exhausted. Thomas possessed the particular stillness that made difficult truths feel safe enough to emerge, his broad shoulders carrying not just physical strength, but the emotional steadiness that comes from understanding patience. Asha kept notebooks filled with sketches of emotional weather, tracking the moods that moved through their community like clouds across an endless sky. Luna's gift for reading emotional colors proved invaluable in guiding their education. She could see which students were ready for deeper work and which needed more time to develop their basic skills. She taught them to distinguish between authentic feelings and their manufactured counterparts, how forced cheerfulness appeared as harsh, orange light, while genuine contentment glowed with the warm amber of honey held up to sunlight. The memory garden became their classroom, a living laboratory where students could practice among plants that held accumulated stories. Ezra showed them how each type of memory required different care. Some needed full sunlight and frequent attention, like the sweet peas that held tales of first love, while others thrived in gentle shade and patient observation, like the lavender that cradled generations of lullabies. Working with memories requires both skill and wisdom, Ezra explained as they sat among the rosemary that held stories of family recipes and kitchen wisdom. But the most important understanding is that you are not meant to be a container for others' sorrows. You are a conduit, helping healing flow through you like water through clear glass. Maya's first real test came when Mrs. Patterson brought a music box that had stopped playing, its delicate mechanism silenced by years of carrying too many sad songs. Under Ezra's gentle guidance, Maya learned to listen not just to what was broken, but to what wanted to be restored. "It's not damaged," she said after holding it with careful attention. "It's just tired from remembering only the endings. It needs to recall the lullabies it used to play when the world felt safer." Working together, they helped the music box remember not the sharp notes of loss but the gentle melodies that had once soothed restless children to sleep. When it began to play again, the tune was softer than before, worn smooth by understanding, but somehow more beautiful for having been broken and mended. As the students progressed, Ezra discovered that teaching others had deepened his own understanding of the work. Each question they asked, each struggle they faced with the delicate balance between compassion and self-preservation, revealed aspects of healing he had never fully explored. Maya's work with her grandmother's angry forgetting taught him that sometimes the kindest response to confusion was not to fight it, but to offer consistent presence, meeting each moment of clarity with gratitude rather than grief for what was being lost. Thomas learned that his gift for creating emotional safety could help entire families understand when to share difficult stories and when to let them rest. Asha discovered that her ability to track emotional weather patterns could help the community prepare for collective challenges, like a lighthouse keeper reading approaching storms in the color of distant clouds. Standing in the memory garden as summer deepened and the lighthouse beam swept across their expanded work, Ezra felt the profound satisfaction that comes from work, serving something larger than oneself. He was no longer just a keeper of lost memories, but a teacher of the gentle arts, helping to ensure that the wisdom of tending human hearts would continue flowing from generation to generation like the lighthouse beam that had guided countless souls safely through darkness. The students had become extensions of his and Luna's work, each one carrying forward not just techniques, but the essential understanding that healing was both individual and collective, that every heart tended with compassion contributed to the vast, interconnected web of human care that made communities not just places where people lived together, but sanctuaries where souls could rest, recover, and remember how to love without fear. Celeste, despite her increasing confusion about specific details, possessed an almost supernatural ability to recognize the quality of attention the students brought to their work. She would sit among them like a gentle presence, offering wordless approval when someone remembered to breathe deeply, nodding with satisfaction when a particularly difficult memory was handled with proper care. Her own journey into forgetting had become part of their education, teaching them that love could exist independent of memory, that connection lived in the quality of presence rather than the accuracy of recall. As the lighthouse beam swept across the harbor with its eternal patience, Ezra understood that his greatest gift to the world was not his ability to help lost things remember themselves, but his willingness to teach others that they, too, possessed the capacity for sacred witnessing, that every human heart could become a lighthouse offering steady illumination to those navigating the sometimes treacherous waters of memory, loss, and the endless courageous work of learning how to heal. The understanding that every human heart could become a lighthouse offering steady illumination would soon find its most profound expression as the woman who had taught them all how to tend lost things prepared for her final journey into the vast, accepting mystery that waits beyond all remembering. Celeste's passage came not as a sharp break, but as the natural completion of a tide that had been turning for months, her spirit settling into the rhythm of letting go with the same grace she had brought to everything else in her long life. It began on a morning when autumn light painted the memory garden in shades of amber and gold. Celeste had spent the night in the lighthouse kitchen, surrounded by mason jars that had always been her companions, her weathered hands arranging them with ceremonial care. When Ezra found her there as dawn broke over the harbor, her face held the luminous serenity that comes to souls who have finished their work in the world. "The jars know their stories now," she said, her voice carrying quiet authority that had always characterized her deepest understanding. "They don't need me to remember for them anymore. They can hold their own light." Her hands rested on the table like birds settling into their final nest. Completely at peace with approaching stillness, Luna appeared in the doorway, her sea-glass eyes reading the emotional colors that surrounded Celeste like a gentle aura. Where once there had been pearl-gray confusion, now there was pure, luminous white, not harsh brightness but the soft radiance of moonlight on water, of love that had learned to exist without needing to possess. They spent the morning together in the memory garden, Celeste moving among plants with the careful attention of someone saying goodbye to old friends. She touched rosemary that held stories of family wisdom, lavender that cradled generations of lullabies, sweet peas that remembered first loves. Each plant seemed to respond to her presence, releasing gentle fragrances that filled the salt air with accumulated contentment. The townspeople began arriving without being summoned, drawn by the mysterious current that had always brought them to the lighthouse during moments of significance. Mrs. Chen brought fresh bread still warm from ovens. Dr. Martinez carried wildflowers from coastal hills. Captain Esteban arrived with quiet reverence, understanding they were witnessing something sacred. As evening approached and the lighthouse beam began its nightly sweep, Celeste asked to be helped to her favorite chair in the lantern room, where she had spent countless nights tending light that guided ships through darkness. Ezra and Luna positioned her chair so she could see both the great lens above and the memory garden below, the two landscapes that had defined her life's work. "I can see them all," she whispered, voice barely audible above the lighthouse's gentle hum. "Every lost thing that ever found its way home, every story that learned to remember itself, they're still here, still glowing, part of something larger than any of us understood when we began." The students gathered in the memory garden below, their young faces turned toward the lighthouse with particular attention that comes to those witnessing something they will carry forever. Maya held her grandmother's hand, both finding comfort in the reminder that confusion and clarity were temporary visitors in the vast house of the heart. As night deepened and stars appeared in clear autumn sky, Celeste's breathing became as gentle as tide pools settling into stillness. She looked once more at the memory garden, at the lighthouse beams sweeping across water that reflected stars like scattered promises, at faces of those who had learned to tend lost things with patient love. "The light continues," she said, her voice carrying certainty of someone who could see beyond horizons. "Different hands, same illumination. The stories remember themselves now. The healing flows like water finding its way to the sea." She passed in the deep hours of night, her spirit settling into silence with the same grace she had brought to everything else. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the harbor, and in the memory garden below, plants held their accumulated stories like candles that would never be extinguished. In days that followed, the lighthouse filled with townspeople who came not to mourn but to celebrate the completion of a life lived in service to something larger than itself. They shared stories of healing witnessed, of memories restored, of countless small moments when Celeste's patient attention had helped them understand that nothing beloved is ever truly lost. Ezra felt grief settle into his chest like winter fog, but underneath was something deeper, gratitude for having been chosen to carry forward work that would continue long after all of them had returned to the vast mystery beyond remembering. The transition felt as natural as changing tides. He simply continued the work, his hands finding familiar rhythm of polishing the great lens, ensuring the beacon swept its patient arc across water. Standing in the memory garden with Luna's hand in his, surrounded by plants that held stories of both joy and sorrow, he understood that Celeste's greatest gift had been not just her ability to help lost things remember themselves, but her demonstration that a life devoted to serving others, healing becomes itself a form of light that continues shining long after its original source has moved beyond. need for any particular form. The lighthouse beam swept across the harbor with eternal patience, and in its steady illumination, Ezra saw the truth that would guide all his remaining years, that love, once given freely, becomes part of the world's permanent illumination, casting light that helps countless souls navigate safely through whatever darkness they might encounter on their own journeys toward home. The truth that love, once given freely, becomes part of the world's permanent illumination settled into Ezra's bones, as seasons turned like pages in a familiar book, whose story deepened with each reading. Years flowed like gentle tides, bringing changes that felt both inevitable and surprising, each one adding new layers to the lighthouse's accumulated wisdom. Luna became his partner in all things, their wedding celebrated in the memory garden, surrounded by plants that held stories of countless other loves. Their ceremony was simple, vows, spoken at sunset, while the lighthouse beam swept across water that reflected their promises like scattered stars, but it carried the weight of understanding that their commitment was not just to each other, but to the work they would continue together. The students they had trained grew into teachers themselves, carrying the gentle arts to places where other communities needed reminding that memories were living things requiring care. Maya established sanctuaries for families navigating forgetting, where love could exist independent of memory and connection lived in the quality of presence. Thomas created spaces where difficult truths felt safe enough to emerge, his gift for emotional steadiness helping entire towns learn to hold their collective sorrows with compassion. Asha became a cartographer of emotional weather, tracking patterns that moved through communities like invisible tides. Her notebooks filled with sketches of how healing moved through gathered hearts, changing everything it touched. Ilara learned to hear the pause inside stories, developing the particular stillness that made difficult truths feel safe enough to emerge. The memory garden expanded into terraced hillsides where plants held accumulated stories of generations. Sweet peas still bloomed in shades of pink that shifted like sunset, their tendrils reaching toward the lighthouse as if drawn by its steady promise. Lavender continued releasing its soothing fragrance, carrying the essence of being small and safe. Rosemary stood sturdy and aromatic, reminding visitors that belonging was often found at shared tables. The archive of small joys grew into a collection that reminded countless visitors that happiness was not a rare treasure, but a daily possibility. Children came to hold smooth stones that had absorbed decades of peaceful mornings, their small hands learning that contentment was their birthright, not something they needed to earn or chase, years layered like sea-polished glass. Salt silvered Ezra's hair, then turned it white, but his hands retained their gentle certainty when holding objects that had lost their stories. His gift evolved with age, becoming less about dramatic restoration and more about quiet wisdom that helped people understand which memories deserved preservation and which could be released with gratitude. Standing in the lighthouse lantern room as his 70th birthday approached like a tide returning to familiar shores, Ezra watched Luna tend the memory garden with the same patient attention she had brought to reading emotional colors. Their life together had become a living demonstration that love deepened through shared purpose, that two hearts devoted to serving others' healing could create something more beautiful than either could achieve alone. On quiet evenings when fog wrapped the lighthouse like a familiar shawl, they would sit among plants that held stories, feeling the accumulated wisdom of all the lives they had touched, settling around them like gentle rain. The lighthouse beam continued its patient sweep across the harbor, and in its steady illumination, Ezra could see ripples of compassion traveling far beyond visible shores. As autumn painted the coastal hills in familiar shades of amber and gold, Hage arrived not as a door slam, but like evening coming to a good book, pages mellowing beneath warm lamplight. Ezra found naps easier. He found gratitude easier. He spoke softly, because everything he needed to say had already been said in the way he lived. On a certain late afternoon, when clouds layered the horizon the color of oyster shells, he handed Ilara a cord with the brass key that had once belonged to Celeste, not as ceremony, simply as a moment that knew itself. "Light wants more than one keeper," he murmured, and Ilara's eyes shone brave and wet. He asked Thomas to remember to laugh with the gulls. He asked Asha to keep drawing weather no one else could see. He asked Maya to teach people how to rest inside their own hearts. He asked Luna nothing, because everything they were had already been answered 1,000 times by the way their fingers found each other's hands. The memory flowers bloomed in cycles of remembering and releasing, their roots intertwined beneath the soil to form an underground network of connection that mirrored the human community above ground. Each plant held not just individual stories, but accumulated understanding that pain shared becomes more bearable, that joy witnessed multiplies, that love remembered never truly dies. The lighthouse beam swept across water that reflected stars like scattered promises, and somewhere in the town below, someone was remembering something beautiful they thought they'd lost forever, while someone else was finally ready to let go of something that no longer served them. The work continued, passed from one generation to the next like a sacred trust, ensuring that no story would be lost, no heart would carry its burdens alone. Standing together in the memory garden as the lighthouse beam swept across their life's work, Ezra and Luna felt surrounded by everyone they had helped, not as ghosts haunting the past, but as living light woven into the fabric of ongoing compassion. The boy who had been found sleeping among forgotten letters had grown into a man whose life itself had become a letter of love written to the world. And with that, he stretched into the stars, knowing that somewhere the light continues, steady and eternal, guiding countless souls safely through whatever darkness they might encounter on their own journeys toward home. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.